Welcome back to my channel. In this short video, I want to talk about handgun modifications for concealed carry, why I make certain modifications and why I don't make certain modifications. And I want to make just kind of a disclaimer. Make sure that before you make any modifications to any of your firearms, make sure you consult local laws, maybe even talk to an attorney who handles cases involving handguns and the Second Amendment, because I don't want you making any modifications that might not be legal in your state. So I'm hoping what this does, it gives you an idea of some of the modifications that you can make, and I'm hoping that these will just make sense. There are a lot of guys out there on the internet, some of them are a lot more qualified than I am to talk about this kind of stuff. I'm just hoping I give the average guy, average user who's trying to conceal carry and protect his family some ideas about some things you can do to make the handguns you have function a little bit more proficiently. So with that said, enjoy the video. As we start this discussion on modifications, I want to make a couple things really clear. One, make sure you check your local laws. Maybe you need to talk to a local attorney to find out if it's even legal in your area to make modifications to a handgun. Also, I want to draw a distinction between making modifications, say, to a gun that you're going to use in competition, or modifications to one that you're actually going to carry and use for self-defense, because the two are probably very different. If I'm modifying a handgun for competition, I'm probably going to do a trigger job. I'll probably, if there's a trigger safety on, I'll probably take this trigger safety off. I'll put a different trigger on it. I'm probably going to lighten the trigger by quite a bit, because the issue with that is going to be speed and accuracy. I might change a recoil spring to a little bit higher weight so it can reduce recoil, those kind of things, where I wouldn't necessarily make those same changes on a concealed carry piece. Now, that doesn't mean you can't use your competition handgun for concealed carry, but my method and my goals for making these modifications are different than if I was making modifications for a competition handgun. So this is my M&P 2.0 C. It's the compact version. It's the 4-inch barrel, and you can see already that I made a couple of modifications. I went ahead and color filled this. Now I want to be careful about when I put engravings or anything like that on my handguns. So let's just say I had written in here, I kill Martians, because I am really out to get Martians, right? And so if I were to actually end up in an event that included killing a Martian, you know, the legal team on the other side could take that, and the prosecutor could say, you know what, he said on his handgun he's out there to kill Martians, and look, here he killed a Martian, so that's going to be probably held against me if I were to ever take this to court. So I want to be really careful. I'm a Christian. I'm still not going to put pithy scriptures on my gun that have to do with anything, not because I don't love the Word of God, but it's just because I don't want anything to be held against me. So all I did is highlight the markings that were actually on this handgun. I have put some true glow sights on here that are tritium, and I've changed the trigger. Now, the other thing I want to talk about, not just how you put markings on your guns, or if you've got a dust cover you put on here, be careful. I'm not going to put, you know, I like the Punisher symbol. I'm not going to put the Punisher back here. I got to be really careful, because this is what I use for concealed carry and for personal defense. So be careful about the engraving. I'm going to put night sights on here because I want this particular gun to function better than it came from the factory, and I certainly can make those modifications. Again, check your local laws. But I also changed the trigger out for a different trigger. Now, it's important to me when I'm making modifications, and you're going to hear this whole theme throughout every handgun I show you, and I'm going to show you 4, that you don't make modifications that move this particular handgun past what the manufacturer originally intended to happen. So Smith & Wesson says on this handgun they provided a hinge trigger safety. I've removed the hinge trigger safety, and I now have a trigger safety that is still here. So if I go to move this trigger back, and I'm pushing hard, it does not fire. In this handgun, by the way, all the handguns today have been checked. I have nothing in the magazines. There's no rounds in any chambers. When I go to pull this trigger, my finger has to be on this dingus, which is the safety, and I can pull back for a nice trigger click. Okay. The point is it still has a trigger safety. It's not the trigger safety that came from the manufacturer, but it still is a trigger safety. So I feel confident to know that's going to pass the muster of any jury or any issue I might have with law enforcement. And again, check your local laws. Maybe you check with an attorney that does legal work with people with firearms and those kinds of things. So I've made changes to this handgun, but I haven't made anything that exceed the purpose the manufacturer had with modifications I've made. That's really important, and you'll hear that again time and time. So I'll put this one away and go to the next one. The next one is my original M&P shield. Now again, I've color coded this, and by the way, my color fill on these, I tried using things like tester paint, and that stuff tends to wear off pretty fast. What I found, actually, guys, if you want to color fill your gun, use fingernail polish. Now, it seems to wear really well. You can see it's nice and bright. Did a good job color filling. And so, again, so I've color filled the important things I feel like are cool. On here, I do have a dust cover, and I think it says 9mm on it. Nothing that's, it's not to kill Martians. Again, I'm going to be really careful about that. No skull symbol, stuff like that. If you want to do it, it's fine. I just don't want that to end up in court. I have done some things internally to this handgun. I've replaced the recoil spring with a stainless steel rather than the polymer because I don't like polymer recoil springs. And I've changed out the trigger. And again, this is a Smith & Wesson, so it used the hinged trigger. And I changed it out with a hive trigger, and I've also put an extended mag extension that's a little bit easier to get to. Now, when I did the trigger job on this, and again, Smith & Wesson had a hinged design. I've now put it into the dingus style design, but I still have a trigger that cannot be pulled unless your finger's directly on that trigger, and then it comes back for a nice crisp trigger pull. When I put this trigger on, one of the problems we had, or potential problems, was if we just put it on and put the gun back together, it would have disabled this safety on the frame. And I'm going to tell you, I'm not a fan of frame safeties, and yet two of my handguns happen to have those. Now, I bought this one from my son, and so if I were to buy this from the store, I probably would not have bought a safety. This is a really low profile safety, so it never gets just bumped on. You have to kind of want to push it. In fact, it's not even that natural for me. So I've never had an issue with the safety coming on. It's pretty low profile and tight to the frame. But again, when I put this trigger on, it actually disabled this safety. And there's a rod that goes from the trigger back to the safety. And I had to file that rod down. And it took a little bit of time to do that. But I did it because I did not want to disable the safety. Smith & Wesson says this gun has a safety on it when it comes from the factory, so I'm going to leave the safety on and make sure it's functional. Now you can, from Smith & Wesson, I think, at least I think you can buy a kit that will remove the safety. And if you've done that and it's the kit from Smith & Wesson, I don't have a problem with it, and legally I think you'll be fine. Just make sure it was from the manufacturer, not just, well, I put this new trigger in, now the safety doesn't work anymore. Well, if that shows up in the court, that could be a problem potentially. So I'm going to make sure again that the gun functions just like it was meant to function from the manufacturer, has a frame safety, and even though it's not the same trigger safety, it still has a trigger safety. Okay, and I also put a set of fiber optic sights on here as well. Okay, so again, gun still functions like it was meant to function from Smith. The safety on the trigger is different, but it's still a safety. And it still has a safety on the trigger, and this safety is still working fine. The next one I'm going to show you, I really just did a video on, but again, I want to talk about it just because I think it's important. This is my G2C by Taurus. I have, in fact, went ahead, this does have a frame safety on it as well. It's a big sucker. Not thrilled about it, but my holsters are not getting in the way. and my purchase on the handgun is not having any issues with that as well. So I'm fine with it on there. It's just how I bought it. I have replaced the guide rod with a polymer titanium guide rod. I have replaced the trigger, not the trigger, but the firing pin housing with stainless steel. None of that impacts the functioning of the gun. It still functions just like it was supposed to function from the manufacturer. I have not put a different set of sights on here yet. I have painted them with some glow-in-the-dark paint just because it helps me pick them up a little bit better. And if you were in a low light situation, you would certainly notice that. I've not tricked out the barrel. I've not made any modifications to the trigger at all. It's still functioning just like it's supposed to from the factory. So I have made modifications internally, but none of those internal modifications affect how this handgun functions from Taurus. I've just made some improvement. It still functions the same way. I've even Cerakoted the slide, so it's a much smoother slide. It's well finished. It's really made this handgun pop, to be honest with you. But it still functions just like it would function from Taurus. So I haven't made any changes here that are going to affect the way this functions, and it still would be considered pretty much functions as Taurus intended it to. And then last and not least is the this particular handgun here. This is a Smith & Wesson EZ 380, and you can see I've color filled it as well. I like the white color fill on this. Now I have not replaced anything on the internals on this particular gun. If I could find a polymer rod for this, I probably would, but you'll notice the guide rod on that is kind of a funny shape, so I don't know if they're going to make them or not. If I did replace the guide rod on this gun, I'd want to make sure it still functioned exactly as Smith has intended it to function. This does not have a trigger safety. It has a grip safety. I'm fine with that. No safety on the frame. You can either get it with or without. And I've not changed the sights, except I have put a drop of the fluorescent paint on here as well. So the only real substantive change I've made is a little bit of paint on the slide on the sights, and I have color filled. And again, no weird phrases like "I kill Martians" or anything like that on this particular gun. I just want to show you this. Again, I've modified every gun that I have. The deal with my wife is, she says, you know what, you've already got 4 handguns, you don't need any more. And I comment to her was, well, then can I upgrade them and make them better? And she said yes. So I hope this has been instructive for you. Again, I don't want to make any modifications to my handguns that make any of my handguns function differently than the original manufacturer expresses in when you buy the gun new. So while I have changed triggers out in 2 of my handguns, they still have trigger safeties on them, even though they're not hinge trigger safeties. Nevertheless, they're trigger safeties. And if there was a safety on the actual handgun, I made sure those safeties were still operational. I don't want to get in trouble in any legal way with the court system that I made modifications to my gun that for example, I'm not going to lighten the trigger if I can help it. First of all, it's a concealed carry gun, not a competition gun. Lightening the trigger might not be the best thing. By the way, the trigger on this thing, not as easy to rack. The trigger on this thing is really pretty light. There's just not much there. Make sure that goes in. Oops, I didn't get that racked all the way. The trigger on this is really light. I love it. So that's just some of the modifications I've made to some of my handguns. Be careful again. Make sure you've talked to people in your state, your location, about the legality of modifying handguns. Some people won't modify their concealed carry pistol ever. They're just going to either use it from the factory or not. Right? In fact, let me bring one of them back for a second trip back. My Taurus, I was actually talking to a good friend of mine today, and he asked me on this particular firearm, how was the trigger? And I said, well, you know, the trigger really could use some work. It's kind of spongy. The reason I got this is because it's a double pull trigger, so I can pull the trigger and I can continue to fire, so I can use this in dry fire practice. But his comment was, you know, how's the trigger? And I said, well, the trigger's a little bit, yeah, you know, it's okay. It's not the greatest, but in that moment where you have to pull your handgun from your holster, point it at somebody and starting shooting because you're in a self-defensive posture. The last thing going through your mind is, gee, this trigger's a little spongy. So just because you can make a modification to a handgun doesn't mean you necessarily have to. Okay, so I know that this trigger is not the best. I know that my Apex trigger is way better than this. I know that my Shield trigger is way better than this. I know that my EZ trigger is way better than this. This is still a decent trigger. I've made the changes in here that make it a lot smoother. It's not getting any grit. It's got a nice easy pull, about 5 pounds or so. But again, just because it's not the best trigger, in that moment, as long as this trigger works, I'm good. I'm not really going to be worried in that moment of split second thinking of drawing my weapon as I'm putting 12 rounds downrange. Gee, this trigger feels a little spongy. That's probably not what's going to be going through my head. And so just a note on triggers. Be careful of the modification you make and make sure the modification you make makes sense. I hope this video has made a little bit of sense. Again, I'm not an expert. This is, again, just one guy's opinion. I'm hopefully making this make sense to just the everyday carry guy that maybe wants to do some modifications to their handguns. So with that said, thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.